Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. It's a huge privilege to be talking with such giants in the carbon ion radiotherapy world. So I really appreciate the opportunity. And I do want to correct one thing. I would not call this the Mayo trial. This is the PROSPER study, and it is a transcontinental or multi-continental, multi-institutional trial. So I don't want people to think that this is just all about Mayo. This is really about the collaboration across a lot of different sites. So this is a comparative effectiveness trial of surgery, carbon ion radiotherapy, and proton therapy for pelvic sarcomas involving the bone. These are my disclosures. So many of you may be wondering why we're interested in conducting a carbon ion radiotherapy trial in the United States, and especially when you look at the PT-COG map of carbon ion therapy centers, and you can see that they're all located in Europe and Asia, and there's nothing in the United States. Well, in November 19th, 2019, we decided to change these things. And so Mayo Clinic, Jacksonville, Florida, announced plans to build the first carbon ion therapy center in North America. And you can see sort of an illustration of what this building will look like. Our plans, we were doing groundbreaking in May of 2022. The integrated oncology building, as shown here, will be planned to open up for treatment with X-ray radiation in late 2024. It will be ready for treatment with proton therapy in very early 2026, and then we'll have carbon ion therapy ready at the end of 2027 or early 2028. Our facility design is shown here. It will have a hybrid synchrotron. We're working with Hitachi, who's building this for us. So a hybrid synchrotron that will be generating protons to 2 proton gantries, shown here, and to the fixed beam room at the end. And then carbon therapy, which will be able to be delivered to that fixed beam room here. We'll also have 3 linear accelerators on an adjacent wall. And so just within a few steps, we'll be able to treat either photons, protons, or carbon. As I said, we had our groundbreaking a little over a year ago. This is from May of 2023, so just a couple months ago. You can see the outline of the building on the site. You can see the cement foundation for the proton gantries, the fixed beam room, and where the synchrotron will be held. We are also hoping to grow this facility, so this has been essentially future-proofed so that we can add on potentially 2 carbon gantries in the future. So since we're only going to be having carbon ion therapy in 2027, why would we be interested in carbon ion trials now? So right away, we realized how important it was for us to gain some experience with carbon ion therapy, and what better way than to have a multi-center trial with centers that have been doing carbon ion therapy to try to gain some of that experience. So that was really sort of the nidus for us to right away think about developing a trial with other institutions. We also felt that it would potentially help us develop and collect the data that the FDA may need to help with getting FDA approval for carbon ion therapy in the United States, and also potentially help in eventually getting reimbursement for the treatment. We have a lot of work to do in the United States that I think has already been done in the European countries as well as the Asian countries. We also felt that by developing this first study, we would be able to potentially start developing the infrastructure that would be needed to do these different transcontinental trials in the future. So in October, November 2019, before COVID hit, we had an idea of how we were planning to develop these trials. So we were initially thinking of just doing a phase 1 trial. So this is not the PROSPER trial. This is what the initial idea had been. It was just simply a phase 1 trial of essentially sending 5 to 10 patients abroad to either Europe or Asia to see if they could successfully receive carbon ion therapy for different radiation-resistant tumors. And we are thinking of 3 different groups of patients, potentially locally recurrent rectal cancers, non-squamous cell head and neck cancers, as well as pelvic bone sarcomas. Depending on the success of this and ability to get funding for additional recruitment of patients, we thought we might be able to roll this into a phase 2 trial in which we treated essentially 15 patients with each of those histologies. Now, as we know, COVID hit, and these trials would have posed some challenge in trying to figure out who would how to pay for the actual carbon treatment abroad. And so, but COVID hit again, and so we had to start from scratch. So then we developed a new team of different researchers at Mayo to kind of brainstorm and come up with ideas of what we could do. The first thing was which disease site would we like to look at? And so we felt that it would be best, since carbon ion therapy isn't a cancer site where there's little doubt that carbon ion therapy would be helpful. And so we were thinking about pelvic bone sarcomas. In 2019 or 2020, we did a systematic review and found 18 publications of patients treated with carbon ion therapy. And I think Dr. Fasadi mentioned this before. These are really rare tumors, and so this is actually a lot of publications, especially when there aren't really that many publications with either protons or photons. And this included 5 prospective studies shown here, as well as 13 retrospective studies that had over almost 500 patients collected. So actually a pretty good amount of data, given how rare these tumors are, that showed that it was safe and effective. Furthermore, in the United States, we utilize the NCCN guidelines. And within bone cancer, you can actually find that they actually mention carbon ion therapy. So if you go down the sort of algorithm for bone cancers, if we look at sacrococcygeal chordomas, if patients are unable to undergo surgery, they say consider radiation if unresectable. And they refer you to the radiation guidelines page, and within the radiation guidelines page, they actually say specialized techniques such as protons, carbon ion therapy, or heavy ion therapy should be considered as indicated. This is because they need to allow high dose therapy while maximizing normal tissue sparing. So this is a big deal in the United States to actually have particles in the actual guidelines. Early on, we tried tooth and nail to get proton therapy into different guidelines. So having carbon ion therapy already there, despite the fact that we don't have any carbon ion therapy centers in the United States, is pretty big. So we have good consensus in the United States that it's a reasonable place to use carbon ion therapy. So the next thing we needed to do is kind of figure out what type of clinical trial design we could do in which we didn't have to send patients abroad, as obviously COVID had shut down travel, and a way that we could conduct this trial and provide some meaningful help while also leaning on accrual in carbon centers abroad. And so we thought about doing comparative effectiveness study in which we compare patients getting carbon ion therapy abroad with patients getting either X-ray radiation or proton therapy at Mayo, or getting surgery in Mayo. And so to kind of further develop this, we kind of looked at some of the data that was out there. The group in Osaka had published some interesting data on carbon ion therapy and surgery in patients with pelvic chondrosarcomas. They demonstrated that when they kind of did a matched analysis retrospectively of patients treated that the local control rates appeared to be quite similar between the 2 modalities. But when they looked at the functional outcomes between surgery and carbon ion therapy, the functional outcomes were quite different, and they favored patients getting carbon ion therapy. They had better ability to walk, their gait was more normal. And so we thought this was potentially an important point that we could show in this trial. There's additional data from QST Hospital and Mayo in this other retrospective comparative study that was done. This study looked at 3 different cohorts of patients. It looked at patients who underwent surgical resection for sacral chordomas at Mayo Clinic Rochester. There's 54 patients in that cohort. It looked at 188 patients who had undergone carbon ion therapy at QST Hospital. And then it looked at a population of 669 patients who were treated either with surgery or with radiation in the National Cancer Center database for sacral chordomas. And they did some interesting cross comparisons. So when comparing the Mayo Clinic Rochester surgical patients with the QST carbon patients, they found, as we had seen before, similar outcomes with respect to overall survival, progression-free survival, and distant metastasis. But they also showed that there actually appeared to be improvements in functional score, although it wasn't quite statistically significant. And they did see less peripheral motor neuropathy favoring carbon ion therapy. When they compared the QST carbon patients with the NCDB patients, when they did the comparison of carbon ion therapy versus surgery, you can see again that the overall survival rates were pretty similar. But when they compared carbon ion therapy to photon radiation, you can see a significant benefit to those patients who receive carbon ion therapy at QST Hospital. Now, obviously, these are retrospective studies and there can be a lot of selection bias issues, but we felt that this was actually reasonable data to help encourage us moving forward with a study in this area. So we thought about developing potential primary endpoints of quality of life or toxicity of when comparing carbon ion therapy to surgery, and potentially looking at local control when comparing carbon ion therapy to proton therapy and photon radiation. Again, a lot of this may look similar to a lot of stuff that Dr. Fossati just talked about in the SACRO trial. Now, another thing our group was considering was how do we make this a study that we can accrue to in a reasonable fashion, especially since this is such a rare disease site. And so we felt making this as pragmatic as possible was important. So we designed this as a prospective cohort study. So this is non-randomized. This is kind of similar to the COMPARE trial in prostate cancer that University of Florida is leading, comparing patients getting proton therapy for prostate cancer at proton centers versus IMRT at IMRT centers. So this is kind of the design we thought, because it really would lead to easier accrual. Again, we have few ineligibility criteria. I will go through those briefly. And we didn't want to put off any of our carbon colleagues. So we really allowed institutional variations in the RT guidelines. I'll go into that a little bit more in a bit. But we really didn't want to be strict and potentially turn collaborators away from enrolling. Based on all this, this would also make this a minimal risk study, since everything would be considered standard of care. So this would make this easier to get it through the different ethics committees and IRBs. So once we had kind of had this backbone of a study, we proposed the concept to some key collaborators, QST, Hospital, Mid-Austrian, Canal, the Shanghai Particle Therapy Center, as well as the University of Heidelberg. And we kind of further developed the study with help from these partners. This is the final schema that we developed, and you can see that we're planning to accrue about 108 patients with non-metastatic pelvic bone sarcomas, and they will be treated on one of 3 treatment arms. The treatment arm 1 are patients getting carbon ion therapy at one of our international sites. Again, these were patients that will be seen at their centers, so they won't be seen in the US and fly abroad. They will be just seen at these centers. The arm 2 are patients undergoing surgery at Mayo Clinic, Arizona, Florida, or Minnesota, and they can get adjuvant radiation either pre-op or post-op as needed. And then arm 3 is just getting definitive treatment with proton therapy at Mayo Clinic, Arizona, Florida, or Minnesota. The follow-up will be done 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and then annually after that with medical history, ECOG performance status, imaging, and then patient-reported quality of life questionnaires, as well as toxicity assessments. The inclusion criteria, we are including patients over the age of 15 with newly diagnosed histologically confirmed pelvic chordomas, chondrosarcomas, osteosarcomas, Ewing sarcoma with bone involvement, rhabdomyosarcomas with bone involvement, or non-rhabdomyosarcoma soft tissue sarcomas with bone involvement. Again, one of the fun things about having these large cooperative group studies is we have to kind of listen to everyone. And so that's how things kind of emerged with respect to being pretty generous with our inclusion criteria. Patients can't have any evidence of distant metastasis and had to have an ECOG performance status of 0 to 2 at baseline. Patients needed to be able to complete questionnaires by themselves or with assistance, as well as be able to provide written informed consent. And chemotherapy is allowed per institutional guidelines. Key exclusion criteria on the study are patients receiving palliative treatment, those who've had recurrent disease, so patients who've had initially surgery and then have a recurrence can't enroll for radiation. Pediatric patients are not allowed. Prior radiation to the site is not allowed, so like a radiation-induced sarcoma would not be included, as well as metastatic patients or benign pelvic bone histologies. Our primary endpoint is actually comparing the difference in change of functional quality of life between the pre-treatment quality of life score to the 1-year post-treatment score. Between carbon ion therapy and the surgical arms, so just arms 1 and 2. And we're doing this using the Promise 29 physical functioning domain, which is made up of 4 questions. These questions are you able to do chores such as vacuuming or yard work? Are you able to go up and down stairs at a normal pace? Are you able to walk at least 15 minutes? Are you able to run errands and shop? And the responses are graded 1 to 5. No difficulty, little difficulty, some difficulty, much difficulty, or unable to do. We had some preliminary data from the Promise 29 and outcomes with surgery, which helped inform us. And so we found that we would expect an average decline of functional quality of life of 2 points following carbon ion therapy, while it would be 4.6 points for surgery. And based on this, we found 80% power with an alpha of 0.05 to detect a significant improvement in functional quality of life with carbon ion therapy over surgery with 30 patients per treatment arm. Our secondary endpoints are going to obviously evaluate local control between carbon ion therapy and proton therapy at 3 years. This is going to be tough, as we know, because of the multiple histologies that have been included. We will try to stratify by histology as well as do subset analyses of sacral chordomas versus non-sacral chordoma histologies. But we do know this is something that may be a challenge depending on what type of patients are actually enrolled in the end. And we will be looking at the local control rate at 3 years. Other exploratory endpoints include local control between carbon ion therapy and surgery, toxicity outcomes, and other PROMIS and ERTC patient-reported quality of life outcomes. Getting back to the radiation treatment, as I said, we're being very pragmatic. This is our first step into the carbon ion therapy world, and we really wanted to engage our colleagues at the different carbon centers. So we didn't want to be so prescriptive with the target volumes or the dose fractionation or the RBE model that was being used. So we really let the institutions determine this, as these centers all have great experience with treating these patients. So we didn't feel we had the ability to tell them how to do it. So it's all at their own institutional guidelines, but we do plan to collect all the DICOM files afterwards, and we will be able to review them, and we potentially can make some comments afterwards about the differences that are observed. The trial infrastructure is really, the funding has come from Mayo Clinic Florida, as well as the Mayo Clinic Enterprise Cancer Center. So that's what's supporting the trial. Mayo Clinic research staff is overseeing the management of the patients treated at Mayo Clinic Florida, Arizona, and Rochester. Since this was our first time doing a trial internationally and overseeing it, we decided it would be best to work with a clinical research organization. And so we're working with ICON, and they are helping with some of the administrative support for just opening up the trial. They're not going to be there to actually collect the data, but they are going to be there to help with the different ethics committees to help with opening it up. They will be doing all the translations of the consent forms and everything else to try to streamline getting this open in Europe and Asia. So we'll see how this works out. We're also paying a case-based rate to the institutions for enrolling patients, and everything's being centralized in a REDCap database. So the timeline, we opened it up at Mayo Clinic Florida about 1.5 years ago, Mayo Clinic Arizona shortly thereafter, and Mayo Clinic Rochester about 1 year ago. We've had some challenges with research staff being able to actually recruit patients to the trial. So while it has been open, it's kind of been held to accrual at different periods of time. But everything's now kind of moving forward cleanly, and we're beginning to enroll patients. So we enrolled our first patient in May of 2023. That was at our center. Patient underwent surgery. We're hoping to have all the European and Japanese sites open by September 2023 and hope to finish accrual by 2026. Obviously, there's been a lot of challenges with this study. It's a rare tumor, so this is obviously extremely difficult to accrue to. I really applaud Dr. Fasadi with what he's been able to do with the SACRO trial, because that's just huge. So we really hope to be able to start accruing pretty rapidly soon. As I said before, international trials for us are potentially challenging administratively, and so we're really hoping to see the value of this CRO company that we're working with. And so we'll learn over the next 3 months if they've been helpful for those different centers in streamlining, opening up the trial, or if they've actually been more difficult to work with, and it would have been just easier to let the institutions do all the work. But again, we're hoping to help these different our partners out in with doing all this work with the CRO company. Again, as mentioned before, is what do we do about these different RBE models for carbon therapy? It's we'll look at things retrospectively, but certainly in the future, as we move forward with future clinical multi-continental trials, it would be great to have an opportunity to have one model used and well accepted. So hopefully we can make progress with that in the future. And finally, with respect to the surgical patient cohort, we realize that these patients are likely to have smaller, less invasive tumors. So we will be keeping this in mind as we examine all the results for this trial. We have had some successes. We published the actual protocol. So those of you who are interested, feel free to look at it. And we've also really had this great opportunity to work with all these great people from all the different great carbon centers shown here. So this has been a huge success for us. And again, as I said before, one of the big reasons we wanted to do one of these clinical trials was to get to know everyone and really get people involved. So with that, I'd like to thank you and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Hoppe. That was a really great lecture. Let's see if I have any questions for Professor Hoppe. Not seeing any on the Google Sheet, not even on the chat. No raised hands. I have a question for you, Professor. Very interesting to see that you have a new facility being built. Are you also planning to have different types of ions? So you mentioned carbon, but during the course of this week and recently, it has been, well, other things like helium have been proposed and are emerging. Some people mention oxygen as well. Is there any plans to have this multimodal ion possibility, possibly for research purposes?
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that question. Yeah, so actually, within that fixed beam room, we'll be able to do both carbon and proton, and we do have the ability to add in additional ion source. So in time, we can potentially look at helium or oxygen, which or some other multi-ion gas that may be able to be fitted to the ion source chamber. So we do have opportunities for that. So we look forward to all the different research opportunities in the future.
Thank you, Professor. I'm seeing a raised hand from Fatima Zara Rimchi. Fatima, would you like to unmute your mic?
Yes. Hello. So I have a question. In your presentation, you've talked about comparison between carbon therapy and proton therapy. And I want to know how we can compare the two modalities, because the principle is different, the objective is different. Since in the case of carbon ion therapy, we use it in the case of very radio-resistant tumors, yet proton therapy is used to protect healthy tissues. Yes, that's the question.
Yeah. So I think both proton therapy and carbon ion therapy have the unique capabilities compared to photons to be able to spare normal tissue. Carbon ion therapy, as you said, is more effective against radiation-resistant tumors, and so the tumors that we're looking at are typically radio-resistant tumors, and so we anticipate the comparison that we'll see a difference in local control favoring carbon ion therapy over proton therapy. And that's a secondary endpoint of the study.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any other questions. So, Professor, thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to having you again for the roundtable later on today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.